Hello again, everyone. This is a discussion of reading number 10, which is actually chapter 1 in my book titled Spirits, Blood, and Drums, the Orisha Religion in Trinidad. It was the first book I published, and it basically covers my work in Trinidad over a period of about 2 years. This first chapter it's not very dense or very difficult to read, as you hopefully noted. It's just a discussion of my experiences in the field that I thought my readers might appreciate. So I'll just walk through and just highlight some of the episodes. You can see they're all separated in here by long dashes. In the first episode that starts on page 3, I'm just noting how surprised I was regarding how real it seemed the spirit possessions actually are. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that I believe that spirits are actually possessing people, but nevertheless, these experiences are real. In other words, they are true dissociative experiences. dissociation, dissociation. I hope I spelled that right. It's a psychological term that is sort of emphasizes the clinical aspects of what's going on. It is a true psychological phenomenon, but I myself and anthropology and social scientists in general do not feel you need to invoke the spirit possession hypothesis in order to understand it. So I covered that in that first part there. Second part was describing, where it starts, the stocky slayer, the sacrificing of animals, something that I was very uncomfortable with. I tend to be a pacifist, but I eventually sort of made my peace with it. I mean, after all, it is an integral part of their religion, and it's not near as bad, for example, as what we do with our livestock. So, you read about that. Then in the next episode that starts on page 5, I arrived at the shrine compound. Here I discovered how symbolically and ideologically complex the Orisha religion is. It's comprised of 5 different cultural/religious traditions. First, there's the African tradition that comes from the Yoruba people in Nigeria, Yoruba. Then there's the Catholic component, which was sort of grafted onto the religion once African slaves were brought here to the New World in Trinidad, because there was Catholicism on the island. It had been settled by French and Spanish people. So you have sort of a Catholic aspect. Then you have a spiritual Baptist component. Spiritual Baptist religion is sort of like a Pentecostal kind of African American religion with some African elements in it. And you see some of those elements in the Orisha religion. Also, too, about half the population in Trinidad is Indian, meaning from India. And so Hinduism is very popular on the island, and people in the Orisha religion have borrowed bits and pieces from Hinduism as well. And then finally, most recently, some Orisha worshippers also practice the Kabbalah, Kabbalah, which they use to conjure spirits, to do spirit work, and so forth. So I discovered all that at that particular shrine. I talk a little bit more about possession beginning on page 6. And I have viewed over 500 possessions. And as I said, I've never seen a reason to invoke a spirit possession hypothesis in order to understand these experiences. But they are very real. As I mentioned, they are dissociative experiences. And exactly what causes them is still a matter of some debate. All right, next on page 8, this is where I discuss my experiences at Woodford Square. You remember when we talked about symbolic anthropology, I discussed Woodford Square. So you get some more information here, and also talk a little bit about how I met one of my main contacts. In fact, he became a friend, Aaron, Aaron, Aaron Jones. And I discussed that there. Next, on page 11, I discussed the time I first began to play drums in the religion. I am musically inclined. I've played professionally in bands around the city when I was a little younger. And I had been listening to all the drum rhythms. There are 7 or 8 of them. And I was actually ready when I was called on. They were lacking a third drummer, and they called on me, and I was able to hold my own, so to speak. And as I mentioned there, the last sentence, I gradually became proficient with the small drum, and Michael, Aaron, and I became a team of sorts as the primary drummers at 2 ceremonies before I left in 1989. Then I'd get into my spiritual Baptist baptism because it was my intent to be initiated in the religion. Of course, I was invited to be initiated. This was not something that I asked for. But if you want to be initiated into the Orisha religion, you first have to be baptized in the spiritual Baptist religion. And that's what I discuss on page 12 and 13. And then at the bottom of page 13, I discuss the African part of my initiation, which was quite an ordeal. Quite an ordeal. It involved about 3 days of fasting and isolation in a small hut. From time to time, Jeffrey, the elder that was initiating me, would show up and give me some secret knowledge and so forth. And then I'm checking the dates. Then on Wednesday, it started on Sunday. And so basically I was isolated. My head was wrapped, my ears were wrapped in order to induce a sort of spiritual trance. And then on Wednesday morning is when I was brought out, and then the ritual proper began to take place. And you can read all about that on page 14. And of course, the most amazing thing, I guess, that happened to me during that point was that at one point in time, I was asked to drink out of a calabash that held this medicinal liquid. And as I looked into it, I had a vision, a very powerful vision. And at the time, I knew that this was just something that I was seeing. In other words, I knew that it was a subjective experience. And looking back on it, I attribute it to basically very little food and water for 3 days, being highly, highly stressed and frankly afraid. And I think it's not really unusual that I would have such an experience. My fellow Orisha worshippers would later tell me that that was common. It was called spiritual seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G. And I've always used that in my discussions and my lectures and even in my personal understanding to try to come to grips with the subjective experiences that people have of their religion. Like, for example, being slain in the spirit, if you're a Christian, or Satori, which is temporary enlightenment in Zen Buddhism, or any other such religious experience that people have. And I have a lot more respect for those. Now, I don't have to agree with their interpretation. I don't necessarily agree with their interpretation. But I do accept them at face value when they tell me they had these experiences. And I sort of describe that on page 16, the last page. Especially you can see where when I sat down with Aaron and he described to me the different gods and what they looked like and so forth. And I took very close notes and listened carefully. Because remember, as postmodernism tells us, there are different truths. There are many truths. There can be an emic truth that may differ quite substantially from an etic truth. And the importance of the emic truth was really driven home to me as a result of my experiences with the calabash.